Now that we've talked about the chemoreceptors that are going to be part of what informs the medulla about our need to breathe or not, let's talk about the whole system for controlling respiration. So the respiratory center is located in the medulla and the pons. So there are also nuclei clusters of neurons in the pons that are going to communicate with these nuclei in the medulla as well. So as much as I give credit to the medulla oblongata for keeping me breathing, the pons is also involved. Okay, so this respiratory center is going to receive input from multiple different sources we're going to talk about in a minute. It's going to integrate that and then send out appropriate signals to the respiratory muscles to breathe. And this is all happening at an unconscious, automatic level. We don't need to think about it. We don't need to stay awake at night in order to keep breathing. I am so glad, right? Now, we do have voluntary control over breathing, but most of our breathing is automatic and is controlled by the respiratory center, and it will adjust the rate and depth of respiration as needed. So the rate, like how quickly you're breathing, and then depth, like how big of breaths are you taking. So there are lots of inputs to the respiratory center. We just talked about the chemoreceptors, the central ones that sense carbon dioxide and pH levels, and then the peripheral ones in the aortic and carotid bodies that sense both of those as well as oxygen levels and send signals either via the glossopharyngeal or the vagus nerves. But we're also going to get sensory input from mechanoreceptors in the respiratory system. For example, there are stretch receptors in the lungs that if you take a huge breath and your lungs start to stretch a little bit too much and your body's worried it might be too much and maybe they're going to pop, it's going to actually inhibit you from further expanding your lungs. It's going to actually inhibit respiration. Irritants can also trigger you to cough or sneeze or to have what's called bronchospasm, where you narrow your airways. We're also going to get signals from the hypothalamus. And so the hypothalamus is like, shoot, it's failing me. He's involved in a lot, okay? He's kind of like Queen Elizabeth's spy master, William Cecil. So he's got his fingers in everything. And the hypothalamus will send signals to the respiratory center in regard to, or in response to strong emotions, for example, fear, excitement, worry, and as well as other sensory inputs like pain or extremes of temperature. So the hypothalamus is going to be sending signals as well. And in this diagram, I should be pointing this out. So in this diagram, they're talking about it here via the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is located right here. So sending signals down into the respiratory center. We already talked about our peripheral and our central chemoreceptors, which are sending signals in as well. The stretch receptors and receptors for irritants I talked about as well. And then we've got your higher brain centers. So all types of things happening in the cerebral cortex. And that's often going to coordinate with the cerebellum when it's voluntary control. So when you want to control your breathing, either because you're doing a meditation exercise or you're yelling or you're singing, a variety of things. So our voluntary control is also going to play a role. So those are the inputs. What are the outputs? So the respiratory center is then going to send motor signals to the muscles of respiration. The primary muscle of respiration, the muscle that does the bulk of the work most of the time, is our diaphragm, that dome-shaped muscle that separates the thoracic and the abdominal cavities. And when it is stimulated, it contracts and moves downward. When it moves downward, it creates negative pressure like a suction in the thoracic cavity, which pulls air in. So it's kind of like pulling back the plunger on a syringe. So what's interesting about the diaphragm is though it's located all the way down, kind of, just above your belly button, the nerve supply comes through the spinal cord and out through C3, C4, and C5, all the way up here. So these axons to send motor signals down to the diaphragm, come out of the spinal cord all the way up here, travel down through the thorax to get down to the diaphragm here. That nerve is called the phrenic nerve. We have one on each side. And so the fact that those spinal nerve roots are C3, 4, and 5 is going to become relevant later on. So diaphragm is the primary muscle of breathing. C345 is the spinal cord level at which those axons are coming out of the spinal cord and bringing those motor signals to contract. 10 times a minute, most of the time, right? Amazing. We also can use other respiratory muscles. So our intercostal muscles in between our ribs can help us expand our rib cage extra for when we do deep inhalation. They can also help us compress our rib cage extra for when we're doing very forced or complete exhalation, like when you're trying to empty your lungs out completely. And then also our abdominal muscles we're going to use for breathing as well. If you've ever done kind of abdominal breathing, or if you're going to blow out candles on your birthday cake and you're getting older and there's a lot of them, right? You're going to recruit your abdominal muscles to help push that air out. So the respiratory center is also going to coordinate motor signals to those other muscles of respiration for us. So in summary, the respiratory control center is located in both the pons and the medulla. It's receiving inputs from those chemoreceptors about oxygen levels if they're peripheral, and then pH and CO2 levels if they're central or peripheral. We've got mechanoreceptors in the respiratory system. We have signals from the hypothalamus that are coming in response to emotion and pain and other things. And then, of course, from higher in the CNS, the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum, we have voluntary efforts to control respiration. So our outputs then are going to be motor signals, efferent signals out to the muscles of respiration, primarily the diaphragm, which is innervated by the phrenic nerve, whose nerve roots are C3, 4, and 5, and then also signals to the intercostal and abdominal muscles when needed. All right, so we'll finish out this lecture next with talking about some cases so you can apply what you've learned. See you there.